The chains bit into Matthew Doyle's wrists as the wind screamed off the Iron Fang peaks, and somewhere behind him, a torch sputtered against the dark, throwing orange light across the frozen square of Frostgate Hold. He had maybe 6 hours before the tribunal bell rang, and they dragged him out to answer for a murder he had not committed. 6 hours before they hanged him, most likely, or worse. Beside him, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating off her skin even in this cold, the orc woman shifted against the prisoner post and the iron cuffs rattled at her wrists. "Stop pulling," Matthew said through chattering teeth. "You will only cut yourself." "I have cut myself worse shaving," she said, though orcs did not shave, and he understood it for the joke it was, dry as the wind. Her voice was low and rough, carrying an accent that turned every word into something with weight to it, like stones dropped one at a time into still water. He turned his head as far as the post allowed and looked at her properly for the first time since the guards had thrown them both against the timber and locked the shackles. She was unlike anything Frostgate Hold had ever chained to that post before. Tall enough that even kneeling in the snow she nearly matched his standing height, with skin the deep green-gray of river stone and black hair braided close against her skull, and threaded through with small bronze rings that clicked faintly when she moved. She wore fitted warrior's leathers, dark and oiled against the wet, laced tight up the sides to hug the strong lines of her body, a wide belt cinched at her waist with a clan token of bone and horn hanging from it, fur lining the collar where it brushed her throat. Even bound, even bloodied at the temple from where a guard's pommel had caught her, she looked like something that had wandered down out of the mountains to remind the town what real danger looked like. "You are staring," she said without looking at him. "I have never been chained to an orc before," Matthew admitted. "Forgive me if I am curious how this ends. It ends with both our necks stretched by morning unless you have a better idea, caravan man." "Guard," he corrected. "Matthew Doyle. Northwatch Trading Company. I was hired to walk the merchant road between Ashford Crossing and this frozen pit of a hold, not to die in its square over a murder some other man committed." Something in her yellow eyes sharpened at that, a flicker of interest breaking through the wariness. "Then we agree on one thing at least. I did not kill your captain either." She said it flatly, without pleading, as though she had already decided pleading was beneath her and beneath the truth of it. "I came to renew the truce tokens, as my clan has done every year since the Iron Fang War ended. I did not come to spill blood in your commander's tent." Matthew believed her. He was not entirely sure why, chained as he was and freezing and staring down the black mouth of a dawn that might kill him, but there was something in the flat certainty of her voice that struck him as more honest than anything Provost Vale had said over the captain's body 3 hours ago, pointing his gloved finger first at her and then, almost as an afterthought, at Matthew himself, standing too close, having seen too much. "I believe you," he said. She looked at him then, really looked, her head turning slow on her thick neck, rings clicking. "Why?" "Because I was standing 10 feet from you when it happened, and you did not have time to draw a blade, let alone use one, before the attackers were already running for the gate. I saw the masks. Whoever did this wanted it to look like your people did it. You told the provost that." "I told the provost that." Matthew's jaw tightened. He did not care for the answer. He had already decided who was guilty before the captain's body was cold. Shagrol Bloodhorn was quiet for a long moment, the wind cutting between them, snow beginning to sift down out of a sky gone the color of a bruise. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its flatness. "You are either a very foolish man, Matthew Doyle, or an honest one. In my experience, those two things wear the same face more often than not." "I have been called both," he said, "usually in the same breath." That earned him something that was almost a laugh, a rough exhale through her nose, and for one strange moment, chained to a post in a dying town under a dying sky, waiting to be tried for a crime neither of them had committed, Matthew Doyle felt less alone than he had in years. The guards changed at the edge of the square an hour later. The new watchman, a boy barely old enough to hold a spear, more interested in stamping warmth into his feet than checking his prisoners. That was when Shagrol went very still beside Matthew, her whole body coiling with a purpose he could feel rather than see. "What are you doing?" he whispered. "Being patient," she said, and from somewhere against the inside of her wrist cuff, tucked into a fold of leather the guards had not thought to search closely, she drew out a thin, curved sliver of bone no longer than a finger joint. "They took my knife, my bow, my clan token they left because your provost is a fool who thinks trinkets do not matter. But they did not think to look for this. A lockpick, a rib bone sharpened. My grandmother taught me to carry one in every binding I own against exactly this." She worked it into the cuff at her own wrist with a patience that surprised him, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, until with a soft metallic click the iron fell open and dropped into the snow. Matthew stared at his own bound wrists, then at her, disbelief and something like hope warring in his chest. "You could have done that hours ago. I was waiting for a guard young enough not to notice, and dark enough that he would not see well even if he did." She rubbed her freed wrist, wincing at the raw skin beneath, then turned toward him, and there was a new light in her yellow eyes, something fierce and decided. "Now, do I leave you chained here, human, to answer for a crime that is not yours, or do I take you with me? You are asking my opinion. I am asking because a man who tells the truth to a provost who does not want to hear it might tell the truth again, somewhere it matters more. I do not save men out of kindness, Matthew Doyle. I am not soft enough for that. But I do not leave debts unpaid, and you spoke for me when you did not have to." He held her gaze, chained, freezing, aware suddenly of how close she had leaned, of the low banked heat of her, of the strange gravity she carried even crouched in the snow. "Then take me with you," he said. "Because staying here means dying for a lie, and I would rather die running than kneeling." Something in her face shifted, approval maybe, or the first small crack of something warmer. She reached across and set the sliver of bone to his cuffs, and her fingers, when they brushed his wrist, were rough and calloused and warm despite the cold, and he felt that touch travel up his arm like a spark finding dry kindling. The lock gave with a click that seemed far too loud in the sleeping square. "Do not slow me down," Shagrol Bloodhorn said, already rising, already scanning the shadows between the hold's log walls for the darkest path to the gate. "I have walked these roads longer than you have known this town existed," Matthew said, rising with her, rubbing feeling back into his hands. "Try to keep up." They ran. The boy guard did not see them go, too busy blowing on his fingers, and by the time the tribunal bell rang at dawn to find an empty post and two sets of open manacles lying in trampled snow, Matthew Doyle and Shagrol Bloodhorn were 3 miles into the white wilderness beyond Frostgate Hold, and the wind had already swallowed their tracks. They did not stop running until the Hold's palisade had long vanished behind curtains of blowing snow, until Matthew's lungs burned and his legs shook, and the only thing keeping him upright was stubbornness, and the sight of Shagrol's broad back moving steady and sure ahead of him through drifts that came up past his knees. She moved through the frozen wild the way he moved through a market square, unhurried even at speed, reading the land with an ease that made him feel, for the first time in his life, genuinely useless. "We need shelter," he finally gasped out, catching up to her at the edge of a stand of black pines. "Before the light goes. A man can freeze to death out here in an hour if the wind picks up." "An orc too," Shagrol said, "though we last longer than you do. There is a hollow beneath that ridge. I smelled water when the wind shifted. Where there is water there is often stone enough to break it." She was right, of course. Half a mile on, tucked beneath an overhang of gray rock furred with old snow, they found a shallow cave mouth barely large enough for the two of them, and within it, blessedly, dry deadfall that had blown in over some previous season and gone brittle and ready for burning. Matthew's hands shook too badly with cold to strike a spark from his flint, and it was Shagrol who finally took the little steel from his numb fingers, muttering something in her own tongue that was probably an insult about human softness, and coaxed a fire to life with 3 efficient strikes. They sat close to it, closer than strangers ought, because the cold demanded it and neither of them argued the point. Firelight moved across her face, catching the bronze rings in her hair, throwing her strong features into shifting relief, and Matthew found himself watching her more than the flames. "Tell me about this provost," she said eventually, breaking a long silence. "The one so eager to see us both hanged before dawn. Halden Vale came up from the southern courts 2 years ago to administer the hold, runs the garrison, the trade levies, most of what passes for law this far north." Matthew rubbed his hands together over the fire. "He has been pushing for months to end the truce your people signed after the Iron Fang War. Says it costs the crown too much in tribute, says your clans cannot be trusted to honor it. And tonight someone gave him proof of that, conveniently, at the very hour I came to renew it. You saw the masks same as I did. Orc masks, badly made, worn by men who ran like humans and swung their blades like humans who had trained with a sellsword captain, not raised in a war camp." Shagrol's jaw tightened, firelight glinting off one long lower tusk. "That was no raiding party of my people. That was a lie wearing my people's face." "I believe you," Matthew said again, and this time she did not question it, only nodded once, slow, as though filing the fact away somewhere important. "Why," she asked instead, "would your provost want a war so badly he would murder his own captain to start one?" Matthew had turned that same question over a dozen times already in the running hours since the square. "Money," he said finally. "It has to be. Vale holds contracts with half the merchant houses south of the mountains, supplying garrisons, selling grain and steel at war prices instead of peace prices. A truce is bad for a man who profits from soldiers needing boots and blades. I have heard talk in the taverns of mercenary companies quietly moving north these past months. Gray Talons, they call themselves. If Vale hired them to wear masks and kill his own man, just to break the truce and blame your clan for it." "Then he has already won," Shagrol finished grimly, "because by morning every hold from here to the coast will believe orcs broke the peace first, and my people will pay for a crime committed by human hands." They sat with that a long while, the fire cracking, snow hissing faintly against stone outside the cave mouth. "We have to prove it," Matthew said eventually. "Find something. A payment ledger, a contract, a Gray Talon insignia, anything that ties Vale to the men who wore those masks." "We," Shagrol repeated, testing the word, "unless you have somewhere better to be." She studied him across the fire for a long moment, and there was something searching in that look, something that made Matthew's chest tighten under her yellow gaze. "My clan will want proof before they believe an outpost of shackled humans over the word of their own envoy," she said slowly. "And they will not welcome a human walking into our camp uninvited, truce or no truce, not after tonight. If I bring you to Bloodhorn territory, Matthew Doyle, I cannot promise your safety with words alone." "Then what can you promise it with?" Her mouth curved, not quite a smile, something more dangerous than that. "There is a way, an old custom. It is not spoken of lightly, and it is not undone easily once claimed. But it would make you mine in the eyes of my people, under my protection, and no warrior of the Bloodhorn clan would raise a blade against a man claimed by their chieftain's daughter without answering to me first." Matthew's breath caught. "Chieftain's daughter. Ugrash Bloodhorn is my father. Did I not mention that?" "You did not." It did not seem important, chained to a post. She shrugged, the firelight sliding over the strong line of her shoulder. "It is important now. If you wish my clan's protection while we hunt for proof of Vale's lie, there is a price, and it is not small. I would be claiming you as mine before my people, human man, fully. Not a jest, not a game to be unmade at your convenience." He should have hesitated. A wiser man probably would have. But 6 hours ago he had been chained to die for a lie, and this woman had freed him with a sliver of bone and a look that dared him to be brave, and something in him had already decided, somewhere back in that square, that he trusted her more than he had trusted anyone in a very long time. "Then claim me," Matthew Doyle said. "I would rather belong to you than die a stranger to everyone." Shagrol Bloodhorn went very still, staring at him across the low fire as though he had said something she had not expected any human to say, something that landed harder than she had braced for. Then she reached across the flames and took his hand in both of hers, rough palm against rough palm, and the warmth of that grip went through him like a struck bell. "Then it is done," she said quietly, "though it is not yet finished. There are words for it before my father's fire. But the claiming starts here, Matthew Doyle, in the cold, with your hand in mine. Remember that, whatever comes after." He did not let go of her hand for a long while, and neither did she pull away. They left the cave before first light, moving north and east along the spine of the ridge toward Bloodhorn territory, and it was on the 3rd mile of that hard, cold march that the wolves found them. Matthew heard them before he saw them, a low chorus of throats opening somewhere in the gray timber below the trail, and Shagrol's hand closed on his arm and hauled him flat against a boulder before he had even finished registering the sound as danger. "Do not run," she breathed against his ear. "Running makes prey of you." 3 gray shapes slid out of the trees below, lean and hungry-looking, winter having stripped the forest of easier meals. Shagrol had no weapon beyond a hunting knife she had taken off the young guard's belt during their escape, small and poor next to the war axe she was used to carrying, but she stepped in front of Matthew without hesitation, blade low, body angled between him and the pack. "Stay behind me. I can fight. With what, your bare hands and your talk of ledgers? Stay behind me, Matthew Doyle, or I will knock you down myself and stand on you if I must." He stayed behind her. It went against every instinct he had, every year of guard work that had taught him to put his own body between danger and the people he was paid to protect. But there was something in the set of her shoulders, the low readiness of her stance, that told him this was not a fight she needed help winning, only a fight she needed him alive to see the end of. The largest wolf lunged first. Shagrol met it midair with a snarl of her own, catching its foreleg on her knife arm, and driving her shoulder into its ribs hard enough to send it tumbling off the narrow trail into deep snow. The second came low for her legs, and she stamped down on its skull with a boot heel before it could close its jaws, a sickening crack swallowed by the wind. The third hung back, snarling, weighing the odds, and when Shagrol turned to face it fully, blood on her knife and murder in her eyes, it thought better of the encounter and melted back into the tree line. She stood there a moment, breathing hard, then turned back to Matthew, and something in his face must have shown because her expression softened by degrees. "You are shaking," she said. "I have never watched anyone do that with a knife that small. It was not the knife that mattered." She wiped the blade on her thigh, sheathed it, and reached to steady him with a hand at his elbow, and this time the touch lingered longer than the cold or the fright required. "Are you hurt?" "No, you are extraordinary." The word came out of him before he had fully decided to say it, plain and stunned and true. Shagrol looked at him for a long beat, snow settling on her dark braids, and something flickered behind her yellow eyes that he was beginning to recognize as the rarest thing he had seen from her yet: uncertainty. "Men do not usually say such things to me." "Then men are fools," Matthew said, "because I have never seen anything like you in my life." She closed the distance between them before he had finished the sentence, and for one suspended heartbeat neither of them moved, close enough that he could feel her breath against his jaw, could see the fine details of her face he had only glimpsed by firelight before, the small scar through one eyebrow, the intensity banked behind her gaze. Then she kissed him, hard and sudden and searching, her hand coming up to fist in the collar of his coat, and Matthew's whole world narrowed to the taste of snow and blood, and the impossible fact of Shagrol Bloodhorn's mouth against his. When she pulled back, both of them breathing unevenly in the cold, she looked almost as startled by it as he felt. "That was not part of the claiming," she said. "No," Matthew agreed. "That was something else." "Good," she said, and took his hand again, and they walked on into the mountains together while the wind sang through the pines and the wolves' cries faded far behind them. The Bloodhorn war camp announced itself first as smoke rising against a hard gray sky, then as a scatter of hide tents dug into a fold of the mountainside, banners of horn and bone snapping in the wind above the largest lodge. Sentries spotted them a half-mile out, and by the time Matthew and Shagrol reached the camp's edge, a dozen armed warriors had gathered to bar the way, spears leveled, faces hard with a suspicion Matthew recognized because he had worn it himself once in a different square, chained to a different post. "Shagrol Bloodhorn returns," one warrior called out, though his eyes were fixed on Matthew with open hostility, "and brings a human into our camp." "I bring a claimed man," Shagrol said, her voice ringing out loud enough for the whole gathering crowd to hear, "and I will answer to my father for it, not to you, Threk." The warrior called Threk was a broad, scarred orc with a jaw like a hatchet, and he looked Matthew up and down with open contempt. "A claimed man. You expect us to believe the chieftain's daughter has taken a human weakling as a mate, after she was sent to renew a truce that broke into blood the same night she left. I expect you to bring me to my father," Shagrol said, "and let him judge the truth of it, rather than standing here barking like a camp dog who thinks himself a wolf." A ripple of low laughter moved through some of the gathered warriors at that, though Threk's face darkened further. Matthew stood his ground beside Shagrol, chin up despite every instinct screaming at him to shrink under the weight of so many hostile stares, because he had learned already, in the space of one long night, that this woman did not want a man who cowered. Chieftain Shagrol Bloodhorn received them in the central lodge, a broad-shouldered orc well into his later years, gray threading his braided hair, scars mapping a long life of war across his forearms. He listened to Shagrol's account of the attack, the masks, the murdered captain, the tribunal post without interrupting, his dark eyes flicking now and then to Matthew with an appraisal that felt like being weighed on a scale Matthew could not see. "You claimed this human," Shagrol said finally, "before my people in the old way." "I did, knowing what that binds you to." "I know, father." Shagrol did not look away from him. "I would not have done it lightly." Shagrol rose from his seat of stacked furs and crossed to stand before Matthew, close enough that Matthew had to tip his head back to meet the chieftain's gaze, close enough to feel the sheer physical presence of the man, the quiet, contained power of someone who had led warriors into battle and walked out the other side more times than he could probably count. "Human," Shagrol said. "Why should I believe you did not simply use my daughter to save your own neck from a hangman's rope?" Matthew held the chieftain's gaze, his heart hammering, and answered as plainly as he knew how. "Because if I only wanted to save my neck, chieftain, I could have run for Ashford Crossing the moment we were free and let your daughter walk this mountain alone. I did not. I am here because I believe her, because I saw with my own eyes that the men who killed that captain were not orcs, and because—" He hesitated, then pushed the words out anyway, aware of Shagrol's eyes on him, aware of the whole silent lodge listening. "Because in one night your daughter has become the truest thing in my life, and I would rather stand accused beside her than safe without her." The silence stretched long enough that Matthew was certain he had misjudged everything, said too much, revealed too much of a heart that had no business being so certain so soon. Then Shagrol Bloodhorn made a low sound in his chest that might have been a laugh, might have been something closer to respect, and turned to his daughter. "He has more spine than his size suggests," the chieftain said. "Very well. The claiming stands under my roof until proven false or broken by choice. But know this, human." He fixed Matthew with a stare that could have split stone. "If you shame my daughter or betray this clan, no claiming in the world will save you from me." "I would not want it to," Matthew said, and meant it. That night, before the whole gathered camp beneath torches and a sky scattered with hard, cold stars, Shagrol Bloodhorn and Matthew Doyle stood before her father's fire and completed the old rite her people used to bind a claimed mate into the clan. It was not the wedding Matthew might have once imagined for himself in some quieter life. No priest, no chapel, no gathered family from a village he had long since left behind. Instead, there was a blade drawn shallow across each of their palms, blood pressed together and bound with a strip of red-dyed hide, and words spoken in the orcish tongue that Shagrol translated for him afterward, low and private, as the camp roared its approval around them. "I said that I choose you," she told him later, away from the fire's light, her forehead resting against his, her claimed mark still stinging faintly on her palm where it pressed to his. "That I will stand against anything that comes for you, and that you belong to the Bloodhorn clan now, for as long as the claiming holds." "And how long does the claiming hold?" Matthew asked, his voice rough with something that was not entirely the cold. "For as long as we both wish it to," Shagrol said, and there was no hesitation in her at all. Living among the Bloodhorn clan taught Matthew things about himself he had never had cause to learn in a decade of caravan work. He learned to skin a mountain hare in the time it took Shagrol to sharpen her borrowed knife. He learned enough of the orcish tongue to greet the camp elders properly, stumbling over the harsh consonants until half the children found his accent endlessly amusing. He learned to carry water uphill through drifted snow without complaint, because complaining earned him nothing but Threk's contempt, and he had decided early that Threk's contempt was not worth feeding. Threk, for his part, did not let the matter rest easily. 3 days after the claiming, as the camp gathered for the evening meal around the central fires, the broad warrior planted himself in Matthew's path with the deliberate menace of a man looking for an excuse. "The chieftain's daughter could have had any warrior in this camp," Threk said, loud enough to draw eyes. "Instead, she drags home a soft human who could not swing an axe if his life depended on it. Perhaps we should test that." "Threk," Shagrol's voice cut across the gathering like a blade, and she was on her feet in an instant, but Matthew laid a hand lightly on her arm before she could step forward. "Let him finish," Matthew said quietly. "I will not hide behind you every time someone doubts me. That is not the man you claimed." Something in her expression shifted, surprise giving way to something warmer, and she sat back down, though her body remained coiled ready. "A trial, then," Matthew said, turning to Threk. "Name it." "But not an axe. I have never claimed to be a warrior, and I will not pretend otherwise to satisfy your pride. Name something a caravan guard might actually know." Threk's lip curled, but the gathered warriors had gone quiet with interest now, and pride would not let him back down. "The ice run," he said finally. "Along the frozen falls to the lower ridge and back. First man to return wins the argument." It was, Matthew realized as they lined up at the camp's edge an hour later, exactly the sort of contest a caravan guard might actually stand a chance at winning, because it demanded not brute strength but careful footing, endurance, and the particular patience of a man who had spent years reading treacherous mountain roads for a living. Where Threk barreled forward with raw power, testing the ice recklessly and slipping twice on the frozen falls, Matthew moved with the deliberate caution of long habit, choosing his footing, pacing his breath, and though Threk was faster on the flats, Matthew gained back every stride of it on the ice, until he crossed the return line a full 10 strides ahead, lungs burning, legs shaking, but first. The camp erupted into a roar that startled him more than the run had. Shagrol reached him before anyone else, hauling him into an embrace that nearly knocked him back into the snow, laughing against his ear in a way he had not heard from her before, unguarded and delighted. "You beat him," she said. "You actually beat him." "Caravan guards spend their whole lives on bad roads," Matthew managed between gasping breaths. "Turns out that is good training for something after all." Even Threk, grudgingly, offered him a nod that night by the fire, not quite friendship, but something that no longer resembled contempt, and Matthew understood that he had earned, in his own way, a small piece of ground in this camp that no claiming ceremony alone could have given him. It was 3 nights after the ice run, with a storm howling outside the hide walls of the tent Shagrol had claimed for them at the camp's edge, that the reckless night happened, the one that would rewrite everything after it. They had been talking mostly, huddled close under firs against the cold, trading pieces of their old lives the way people do when the world outside has narrowed to a small warm space and 2 voices. Matthew told her about growing up in Ashford Crossing with no family beyond an aunt who had died when he was 17, about years of caravan roads that had left him competent and respected, but always, somehow, alone, moving through towns where he knew everyone's name and belonged to no one. Shagrol told him about a mother lost to fever when she was young, about a life spent proving herself twice over as a chieftain's daughter expected to lead one day, about the particular loneliness of being feared and respected in equal measure, but rarely simply wanted. "No one has ever asked what I wanted," she admitted quietly, firelight catching the rare vulnerability in her face. "Only what I could do, what I could lead, what I could win." "I want to know what you want," Matthew said. "Not the chieftain's daughter, you." She looked at him for a long time, something fierce and uncertain warring behind her eyes, and then she reached out and pulled him toward her, and the storm outside seemed to fall away entirely. "I want this," she said against his mouth. "I claimed you to save you, Matthew Doyle, but that is not why I want you now." What passed between them that night was neither hurried nor careless. Despite how it began in the sudden heat of a storm and months of loneliness finally breaking open in both of them at once. It was slow where it needed to be slow, her hands unexpectedly gentle against his skin despite their strength, his own steady and sure despite the trembling wonder underneath. Both of them learning the other with the particular hunger of two people who had spent their whole lives waiting without knowing what they were waiting for. Afterward, wrapped together beneath the furs while the storm raged on outside, Shagrol pressed her forehead to his chest and said, so quietly he almost missed it beneath the wind, "I did not know it could be like this. Wanted, and not just needed. You are the first thing I have wanted in years that did not feel like it would break under my hands," Matthew answered, and felt her smile against his skin, and understood that whatever the claiming had started, this was the moment that had truly bound them, beyond any ceremony, beyond any blade drawn across a palm. Neither of them spoke of undoing it. There was nothing in either of them left that wished to. The scout arrived 11 days later, half frozen and stumbling into camp with news that changed the shape of everything. Provost Halden Vale had declared the Bloodhorn clan in open breach of the Frostgate truce, had rallied the garrisons of 3 border holds under the banner of vengeance for the murdered captain, and was marching companies of hired blades north even now, gray talon mercenaries dressed as regular soldiers, toward Iron Fang territory. "War," Shagrol Bloodhorn said grimly, when the council gathered to hear the news. "He has what he wanted." "Not yet," Matthew said, stepping forward despite the weight of every eye in the lodge turning toward him. "Not if we can prove what actually happened that night before the first blade is drawn." "And how do you propose to do that?" Threx said, though without his old contempt now, "when the man who wants this war controls the very hold where the truth might be found?" "Because I know that hold," Matthew said. "I have walked its warehouses and counting rooms for years as a caravan guard. If Vale paid the Grey Talons to stage that attack, there will be a ledger somewhere, a payment record, a contract bearing his seal. Men like him do not spend that kind of coin without writing it down somewhere they think is safe." Shagrol was watching him with an expression he had come to recognize, pride tangled with fear, the particular look of a woman who loved a man enough to be terrified of what he might risk for the truth. "You mean to go back into Frostgate Hold, the very place that chained you to a post to die?" "I mean for us to go back," Matthew said, meeting her eyes. "Together. Because if this war starts, it will not stop at some border line on a map, Shagrol. It will come for your clan, and it will come for every human town along this frontier. And it will not stop until thousands are dead on both sides for a lie one greedy man told to line his own pockets. I would rather risk my neck trying to stop it than live safe and let it happen." Shagrol studied his daughter and the human she had claimed for a long, weighing moment. "If you do this," the chieftain said finally, "you do it with warriors at your back, not alone. The Bloodhorn clan will not send its daughter into a den of enemies without support, whatever comes of the peace or the war after." "Then send us with a small party," Shagrol said, quiet enough to move unseen. "We do not need an army for this, father. We need proof and speed before Vale's companies reach the border." They left within the day, Shagrol and Matthew riding at the head of 6 Bloodhorn warriors including, somewhat to Matthew's surprise, Threk himself, who had asked to come along with a gruffness that suggested he considered it a debt owed rather than a favor given. They reached the outskirts of Ashford Crossing 3 days later, having skirted well clear of Frostgate Hold's main roads. And it was there, in the trading town Matthew had called something like home for years, that the second great danger of their journey found them, not in the wild, but in the crowded heart of a public square. Ashford Crossing's market square was thick with people the morning Matthew and Shagrol rode in, word of the coming war already spreading like fever through the crowd, fear turning neighbors sharp-eyed and suspicious of every shadow. It was meant to be a quiet stop, a chance to trade for supplies and gather word of Vale's movements before pressing on toward Frostgate Hold itself. But quiet was not a thing that lasted long once someone in the crowd got a clear look at Shagrol's tusks and green-gray skin above the collar of her furs. "Orc!" The cry went up from somewhere near the grain stalls, sharp with panic. "There is an orc in the square." What had been an ordinary market morning curdled in the space of a breath into something Matthew had seen only in his worst imaginings. Men reached for tools, for the belt knives most carried for skinning game, for anything that might serve as a weapon. A woman screamed for her children to run indoors. Someone hurled a stone that struck Shagrol's shoulder hard enough to make her stagger, and the sight of blood, even orc blood, only fed the crowd's fear rather than sating it. "They killed Captain Roswell at Frostgate," someone shouted. "The provost said it himself, the orcs broke the truce. They mean to burn every hold along the border." "That is a lie." Matthew's voice cracked across the square as he threw himself between Shagrol and the surging crowd, arms spread, putting his own body squarely in the path of the next thrown stone. "Listen to me. I was there the night Captain Roswell died. I saw the men who killed him with my own eyes, and they were not orcs. They were hired blades wearing masks, paid by Provost Vale himself to break the truce and start this war. Get out of the way, Doyle." Someone yelled, a man Matthew had known for 6 years hauling grain sacks at the same market. "That thing does not belong here." "She is not a thing," Matthew shouted back, fury cutting through fear for the first time in his life more strongly than any instinct toward self-preservation. "Her name is Shagrol Bloodhorn, and she has done more to try to stop this war than any of you standing here with rocks in your hands. If you want to hurt her, you go through me first." The crowd hesitated at that, some of the raised weapons faltering, but a young man near the front, wild-eyed with fear and grief, Matthew would learn later that his brother served under Roswell's command, lunged forward with a drawn knife aimed not at Shagrol but at Matthew himself, screaming something about traitors who lay with monsters. What happened next would be told and retold in Ashford Crossing for years afterward, though never quite the same way twice. Shagrol Bloodhorn moved faster than the eye could follow, catching the young man's knife arm and wrenching it aside with brutal, controlled efficiency, disarming him without breaking a single bone, though she could have snapped his arm like a dry branch if she had wished to. She did not strike him. She simply held him, immobile, the knife clattering to the cobblestones, and turned her furious yellow gaze out across the stunned crowd. "I could kill every soul in this square who raises a hand against him," she said, her voice carrying with terrible clarity across the sudden silence, "and none of you standing here with your stones and your knives could stop me. But I will not, because Matthew Doyle taught me that the difference between a monster and a person is not the shape of your face. It is the choice you make when you hold power over someone weaker than you. I am holding that choice right now. Choose carefully whether you want to force my hand." She released the young man, who stumbled back into the crowd and stood there, breathing hard, blood still trickling from the stone strike at her shoulder, beside Matthew, who had never once stepped back from her side through any of it, and the square held its breath. It was an older woman near the well, one of the market's long-time bread sellers, who finally broke the silence. "Doyle," she called out, her voice shaking but clear. Is it true? About the provost? About the masks? I swear it on my life, Matthew said, turning to face her, to face the whole crowd now watching him with something shifting from fear into uncertain, desperate hope for a truth that might not mean war after all. I was chained beside her at that post, ready to be hanged for a lie, and she picked the lock and freed us both rather than let an innocent woman burn for a crime some greedy man in a fine coat wanted blamed on her people. If any of you still doubt her, doubt me instead, because I will stand here and swear to every one of you that Shagrol Bloodhorn has more honor in her than the provost who chained us. The square did not erupt into cheers. It was not that simple, not after years of hard history and fresh fear. But the weapons lowered slowly, one by one, and the crowd's fury cooled by degrees into something closer to watchful, uneasy silence, and no more stones were thrown. Threk, who had held his warriors back at the square's edge on Shagrol's earlier order despite every instinct to intervene, met Matthew's eyes across the crowd with something that looked, for the first time, genuinely like respect. "You did not flinch," the warrior said quietly once they had withdrawn to the stables at the edge of town, "even facing a blade." "I have flinched from plenty in my life," Matthew admitted, hands still shaking with the aftermath of it, "but not from protecting her. That I could not do." Shagrol said nothing through most of it, tending the shallow cut at her shoulder with quiet, businesslike efficiency. But when Matthew finally sat beside her in the straw of the stable, exhausted and wrung out, she set the bandage aside and pulled him into an embrace so fierce it drove the breath from him. "You stood in front of a mob for me," she said against his hair, her voice rough with something that was not quite anger and not quite tears. "You could have died. I would rather die standing beside you than live having let them hurt you," Matthew said simply. "That is not a choice I had to think about, Shagrol. It made itself." "No one has ever done that for me," she said. "Not once in all my life. Feared for, yes. Respected, yes. But never simply chosen over their own safety without hesitation." "Then you have not been paying attention," Matthew murmured, "because I chose you the night you picked that lock, and I have not stopped choosing you since." She kissed him then, slow and grateful and fierce all at once, and around them the ordinary sounds of the stable continued, horses shifting, straw rustling, the world going on as though it had not nearly ended in blood in the square outside. They found what they needed 2 nights later, in a locked strongbox in the counting house of a Frostgate-hold merchant named Corliss Bray, a man Matthew remembered from years of caravan runs as one of Vale's closest business partners. Getting into the counting house had required Shagrol's particular talents once again, the same small sliver of bone that had freed them from the prisoner post making short work of a much finer lock, and the ledger they found within, along with a sealed contract bearing both Bray's signature and the crest of the Grey Talon Company, laid the whole scheme bare in cramped, damning handwriting. Payment for special services rendered at Frostgate, dated the very night Captain Roswell died, alongside notes on the anticipated profits from war contracts once the truce collapsed. It was not proof enough to hang Vale outright, not without a magistrate willing to act on it, but it was proof enough to shake the certainty of every hold administrator and garrison captain who had taken the provost's word as truth, and that, Matthew knew, might be enough. They rode into Frostgate hold itself 6 days after fleeing it as condemned prisoners, this time with 6 Bloodhorn warriors at their back, a damning ledger in Matthew's saddlebag, and word already spreading ahead of them that the caravan guard and the chieftain's daughter who had escaped the tribunal post were returning, not to flee, but to speak. Provost Halden Vale met them in the very square where Matthew and Shagrol had once been chained, surrounded by garrison soldiers, his face carefully composed into outrage as Matthew dismounted and held up the ledger for the gathering crowd to see. "This man is an escaped prisoner," Vale announced, "consorting with the orc who murdered Captain Roswell. Seize them both." "Seize us for what?" Matthew called back. loud enough to carry across the square where a crowd was already gathering, drawn by the commotion. "For finding the ledger that proves you paid Grey Talon mercenaries to murder your own captain and blame it on the Bloodhorn clan." The garrison soldiers hesitated, several exchanging uneasy glances, and Vale's composure cracked by a visible degree. "Lies," he spat. "Fabrications from a traitor and his orc whore." The word landed like a struck blow, and Matthew felt Shagrol go rigid beside him, but it was Threk who spoke first, stepping his horse forward with a growl low in his throat that silenced half the square. "Careful what you name the chieftain's daughter, little man," Threk said, "or I will forget that we came here for peace and not for blood." Matthew did not wait for the moment to sour further. He strode forward and threw the ledger down at Vale's feet, along with the sealed contract, letting the gathered crowd see the merchant Bray's signature, the Grey Talon crest, the damning dates. "Read it," Matthew said. "Or better, let the garrison captains read it, and the magistrate, and every merchant house that has ever done business with Corliss Bray, and let them decide for themselves whether they believe a provost who chains innocent people to posts and calls proof of his own crimes a lie." It was the garrison's own senior captain, a grizzled woman named Captain Yorwith, who had served at Frostgate longer than Vale had held his post, who finally stepped forward and picked up the ledger, scanning the entries with a deepening frown. "This is Bray's hand," Yorwith said slowly. "I have seen enough of his shipping manifests to know it. Provost, why does this ledger show a payment to Grey Talon captains, dated the very night Roswell died?" Vale's face had gone the color of old ash. "A forgery," he tried, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty, and the crowd around them, already primed by weeks of fear and rumor, was beginning to turn a different kind of attention on him now, sharp and questioning rather than simply hostile toward the orc in their midst. It took another hour of argument, of Captain Yorwith sending soldiers to fetch Corliss Bray himself for questioning, of Vale's protests growing steadily more frantic as his own hired witnesses began quietly slipping away from the square rather than perjure themselves further on his behalf. But by the time the sun began sinking behind the Ironfang peaks, painting the square in long orange light, Provost Halden Vale stood under armed guard rather than commanding it, and Corliss Bray, faced with the ledger bearing his own signature and the prospect of hanging alone for the whole conspiracy, had already begun talking rapidly and at length about payments, about mercenaries, about a scheme to break the Frostgate truce for profit that had never involved the Bloodhorn clan at all. Captain Yorwith turned to Shagrol then, and for a long moment the two women regarded each other across the square, the human captain and the orc envoy who had nearly hanged for a crime that was never hers. "On behalf of this garrison," Yorwith said finally, "I offer apology for what it is worth after everything you have suffered for our administrator's greed. The truce stands. I will see to it that word reaches every hold along this frontier before Vale's mercenary companies can cross the border and turn rumor into real bloodshed." "That is worth more than you know," Shagrol said, and something in her posture eased for the first time in days, the tension of weeks of danger finally beginning to loosen. The crowd that had once thrown stones at her now watched in a very different silence, and Matthew, standing beside her with the weight of the ledger finally out of his hands, felt something in his chest unclench that he had not realized he was still holding since the night they fled the prisoner post together. The Frostgate truce held, in the end, though it took weeks more of careful diplomacy, garrison captains and clan elders meeting under careful watch to renew the old agreement properly, this time with witnesses enough from both sides that no single greedy administrator could twist it into war again. Provost Vale was stripped of his post and sent south in chains to answer to the crown's own magistrates, and Corliss Bray's testimony, along with the ledger Matthew and Shagrol had risked everything to find, ensured that the truth of the false flag attack became common knowledge across every border hold from Frostgate to Ashford Crossing. It was 3 months later, with the last hard grip of winter finally beginning to loosen its hold on the northern passes, that Matthew Doyle and Shagrol Bloodhorn rode back into Ashford Crossing together, not as fugitives, not as scandal, but as the two people whose testimony and courage had stopped a war before it truly began. Word had traveled ahead of them, as word always does in a border town hungry for good news after a hard winter of fear, and the square that had once turned on Shagrol with stones and drawn knives was filled instead with a crowd that had gathered deliberately, expectantly, to welcome them home. The old bread seller who had first called out to ask if Matthew's testimony was true stood near the well again, and this time she raised a hand in greeting rather than fear as they rode in. Children who had been dragged indoors screaming at the sight of an orc months before now peered curiously from doorways, whispering to each other about the woman who had helped stop a war. Even the young man Shagrol had disarmed in the square, the one whose brother had served under Captain Roswell, stepped forward from the crowd as they dismounted, his face flushed with something between shame and gratitude. "I owe you an apology," he said, addressing Shagrol directly, his voice unsteady but sincere. "I was ready to see you dead for a crime you never committed because I was afraid and grieving, and it was easier to hate something I did not understand than to ask questions. I am sorry." Shagrol studied him for a long moment, and Matthew, watching, saw something settle in her that had perhaps been waiting a long time to settle, some old weariness finally allowed to ease. "Grief makes fools of us all sometimes," she said. "I do not hold it against you, so long as you have learned something from it." "I have," the young man said, and stepped back into the crowd looking lighter than he had arrived. Captain Yorwith herself had ridden down from Frostgate Hold for the occasion, along with a small honor guard, and it was she who called the gathered crowd to order in the square, standing beside the town's own magistrate on the steps of the market hall. "6 months ago," Yorwith announced, her voice carrying easily across the crowd, "this frontier stood on the edge of a war built entirely on a lie that would have cost thousands of lives on both sides of the Ironfang Mountains to enrich one greedy man's purse. That war did not happen because a caravan guard and an orc envoy, chained together to die for a crime neither committed, chose instead to trust each other, to seek the truth together, and to risk everything to bring that truth home. I do not think this frontier has properly thanked them for it." The crowd's response was not the wild cheering of some victory feast, but something quieter and, Matthew thought, more meaningful. A slow, spreading wave of applause that grew as it moved through the square, townsfolk who had once thrown stones now clapping, some calling out Shagrol's name alongside his own, the old suspicion not entirely gone, prejudice built over generations rarely vanishing in a single season, but genuinely shifting, cracking open into something like acceptance for the first time in the history of the border. Shagrol Bloodhorn had traveled down from the mountain camp for the occasion as well, standing at the edge of the crowd with several of his warriors, including Threk, who caught Matthew's eye across the square and offered a nod that had, by now, become entirely free of its old contempt. It was the chieftain who spoke last, once Yorwith and the magistrate had finished their formal words, stepping forward to stand beside his daughter and the human she had claimed in the snow so many months before. "When my daughter told me she had claimed a human man to save his life," Shagrol said, his voice rough but carrying, "I will admit I did not expect it to end in peace between our peoples instead of deeper war. I have led the Bloodhorn clan for 30 years, through the Ironfang War and the uneasy truce after it, and I tell you now, standing in this square where humans once chained my daughter as a criminal, that I have never been prouder to call a human my kin than I am today." He turned to Matthew then, and to the surprise of the gathered crowd, extended his forearm in the warrior's grip that Matthew had learned, over months among the Bloodhorn clan, was reserved for those the chieftain considered true equals. "You are family now, Matthew Doyle," Shagrol said simply. "Not because a claiming bound you to my daughter in the snow, but because you have proven again and again that you deserve to stand beside her." Matthew gripped the chieftain's forearm, his throat too tight for words for a long moment, and it was Shagrol who finally broke the silence, stepping close against his side and taking his hand in hers before the whole watching square. "He was chained beside me at a prisoner post, waiting to die for a lie," she said, loud enough for the whole crowd to hear, her voice steady and sure. "I picked the lock that night because I could not let an innocent man hang. I did not know then that in freeing him I would also be freeing something in myself I did not know was locked away. He is not simply a man I claimed to save his life. He is the truest thing I have ever chosen, and I would choose him again in that same cold square 1,000 times over. And I would let you," Matthew said, his voice thick with everything he felt and had felt since that first frozen night, "every single time." He kissed her then, in the middle of the Ashford crossing square, before the whole gathered crowd of townsfolk and Bloodhorn warriors and border soldiers. And this time no stones flew, no weapons rose, only a warmth that spread through the crowd like the first true thaw of spring after a long, hard winter. They stayed in Ashford crossing through the following weeks, not to settle permanently, for Shagrol's place remained partly among her clan in the mountains, and Matthew found he no longer wished to imagine a life that did not include those hard, beautiful peaks, but long enough to see the market square fully rebuilt in spirit as well as trade, long enough for the old bread seller to press a warm loaf into Shagrol's hands one morning, with nothing more than a quiet nod of welcome, long enough for the young man who had once drawn a knife to bring word, sheepishly, that his brother's old commander wished to formally thank them both for exposing the truth behind Roswell's murder. In the end, they built a life between two worlds, dividing their seasons between the Bloodhorn camp in the Iron Fang Mountains, where Shagrol standing among her people had only grown since the ice run and the war that never was, and Ashford Crossing, where Matthew's old work with the Northwatch Trading Company slowly transformed into something new, a role escorting caravans not just of goods, but of trust between human holds and orc clans still learning to walk the fragile, hopeful path of a truce that finally, truly held. On the anniversary of the night they had first been chained together at that frozen post, Matthew and Shagrol returned to Frostgate Hold once more, not as prisoners, not even entirely as heroes anymore, simply as two people whose lives had become inseparably, permanently woven together. They stood together in the square where it had all begun, the old prisoner post long since torn down and replaced with a small stone marker commemorating the peace that had followed, and Shagrol pressed her palm, the old claiming scar still faintly visible across it, against Matthew's own matching scar. "No regrets," she said, the way she had come to say it often now, a private ritual between them. "None," Matthew answered, as he always did, "not one, not for any of it." The wind that night was gentle, nothing like the howling storm that had first driven them together in a cave beneath a frozen ridge, and above them the stars spread clear and bright across a sky no longer heavy with the threat of war, and Matthew Doyle, once a lonely caravan guard who had spent years walking hard roads without ever truly belonging anywhere, stood in the square that had almost killed him with the fierce, magnificent woman who had chosen him, freed him, claimed him, and loved him into something whole, and understood at last, fully and without doubt, that he was no longer alone and never would be again.